Yes, dear friends, I would like to thank Razvan and the Cambridge Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies for inviting me to share some thoughts on ecumenism. We are on a way to a conference. My title is Generosity and Structures, Orthodox Ecumenism between East and West. We are on the way to a conference that seeks not only to emphasize the value of dialogue among the various Christian churches, something which is not self-evident in an Orthodox context, but also to contribute to a paradigm shift in the perspective we Orthodox view the movement for the restoration of Christian unity. My basic position is that Orthodoxy currently has a theological and structural, both theoretical and practical deficit in the way it approaches inter-Christian dialogue, a deficit that must be identified honestly in order to be remedied. My thoughts are based on my readings of modern Orthodox theology and on my experiences as an ecumenist moving between the European East and West, mostly between Greece and Germany. I apologize in advance for the very schematic way in which I will address some issues, as well as for the fact that I will basically be complaining and grumbling, not because I'm unaware of the positive contributions of our church to the dialogue, but because I believe we should also address our weaknesses. And I would also like to apologize for my English, the English of a Greek who essentially speaks, writes, and even dreams in German. My first point, the Orthodox discomfort regarding ecumenism. Although renowned theologians such as Father George Florovsky and Dumitru Staniloae have used the term ecumenism positively even in the titles of their studies, this term, as well as related ones, is treated with suspicion or even open hostility in large parts of the Orthodox world. The Eastern Church has been present in ecumenical dialogue, sometimes with pioneering contributions, since the beginning of the movement for the restoration of Christian unity. It has repeatedly expressed in a synodal way its support for dialogue with other churches and has indeed achieved many things. The testimony of His All Holiness, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, is tremendous. And no, this is not a typical Greek exaggeration, it is tremendous. However, a simple search on the internet reveals a plethora of books, articles, and conferences that discuss and, of course, condemn the heresy, sometimes even pan-heresy, this is how they call it, of ecumenism, which forces every Orthodox theologian open to dialogue to struggle against numerous theological misunderstandings, not to mention personal attacks. The editors of a festive volume dedicated to a pioneer of dialogue in Germany, the Greek Orthodox Metropolitan Augustinos Lambardakis, titled it, using a quote of the Metropolitan, they gave it the title, Ecumenism is not a heresy, Ekumene is keine Heresie, precisely in order to reassure and affirm that for Orthodoxy, dialogue with brothers and sisters from other churches is an authentic expression of faith and not a cause for concern. It's no coincidence that this volume was dedicated to an Orthodox bishop, a volume with such a title. I find it difficult to imagine something similar, at least in the Western European context, being necessary for a Roman Catholic or a Protestant clergyman. For them and their congregations, ecumenism is much more self-evident. It is obvious that opposition to ecumenism is not limited to the use of a specific term, but concerns the content associated with it. I do not wish to describe what is said against other confessions and dialogue with them by the sworn enemies of ecumenism, who are many, and if we deny this, we are simply hiding behind our finger, and who hold important positions. Nor do I wish to comment in detail on the phenomenon of indifference toward it. Many do not actively fight against ecumenism, but consider it a rather insignificant, perhaps even luxurious, yet ultimately hopeless endeavor. In my opinion, a very important problem lies in the fact that even ecumenically open Orthodox Christians are extremely reluctant when it comes to discussing issues such as the ecclesiological status of other churches, the recognition of their sacraments, or the concrete steps needed to pave the way for future unity. After almost 18 years of ecumenical work, I'm tired of reading abstract assurances about Orthodoxy's readiness for dialogue, abstract hymns about the importance of unity, and the same overviews of Orthodox initiatives in ecumenical dialogue that happened in the past. Likewise, the limits of an ecumenism expressed through gestures and symbols are becoming increasingly clear to me. Cordial personal relationships that develop in the context of dialogue with brothers and sisters from other churches are good. They are important. But are they enough? Even when considering very positive synodal and theological steps toward ecumenical openness, there are still outstanding issues. The greatest tensions within the Holy and Great Council, Crete 2016, emerged during the discussion of the Council's document on relations with other Christians. This ultimately led to the approval of a text that decisively emphasizes Orthodoxy's willingness to participate in dialogue, but appears extremely hesitant to articulate a theology of ecumenism. The controversies at the Council surrounding the term historical name for other churches showed that within Orthodoxy there remains significant ecclesiological ambiguity concerning even the basic foundations of dialogue, an ambiguity the Synod was unable to resolve, nor could it have, since such clarification requires decades of multi-level preparatory work. However, even the significantly compromise-oriented text of the Holy and Great Council was met with strong opposition, not only from well-known fundamentalist networks, but also from the synods of the churches that refused to send delegations to Crete. One would expect bold proposals and an ecumenical vision from an exceptional text written by representatives of the theological avant-garde in Orthodoxy. Yet the text of the Ecumenical Patriarchate for the Life of the World, for that's the text that I mean, is also notably hesitant in its statements on inter-Christian dialogue and on other Christians, even in its use of the term church for them. Orthodox parishes are generally closed ethnic communities with little interest in, if not outright rejection of, theological communication with other Christians. Even in the diaspora, I'm thinking mainly of Germany, this is my experience, believers rarely hear anything relevant. The rhetoric of many monasteries exacerbates hostility toward the other. Priests and theologians generally have limited training in ecumenical matters, while structures for dialogue with other churches are in many cases, not all, but in many cases, rudimentary. The Orthodox double language is scandalous. At extra toward other churches, there is a declaration, albeit abstract, of openness and generosity. At intra, when we Orthodox speak among ourselves, the extra ecclesiam nostram nulla salus prevails. The WCC described Anastasius of Albania as a giant of the ecumenical movement, and his contribution was indeed significant. But how does this fit with statements such as the sacraments performed outside the Orthodox Church are invalid, debates on which he justified his refusal to recognize the Orthodox Church of Ukraine? And one has to note that such exclusivist positions he himself in other cases challenged through his actions or his silence. If this ambivalence is evident in Anastasios, one can imagine what happens with many other Orthodox hierarchs. Second point, the theological deficit and its overcoming. We usually interpret the ambivalence, hesitation, or open rejection of ecumenism by a large part of the Orthodox world by attributing it to historical and cultural factors, the dominance of nationalist narratives, the various forms of anti-Westernism permitting much of Orthodox theology, and the networks of fundamentalists, both monastic and lay, that shape the Orthodox world that influence, the Orthodox world. It's often assumed that if these related factors were addressed, the ecumenical potential of Orthodoxy would naturally emerge. But are there any magic solutions? Can we escape history? The factors mentioned above, along with others, do indeed fuel Orthodox anti-ecumenism. Yet it is necessary to address theological problems as such and not simply reduce them to their historical context. Both the Roman Catholic Church and Protestantism have very clear theological positions on the ecclesiological reality of other churches. Orthodox's heterodox interlocutors expect clear answers as to whether and how our church views them as ecclesiological realities. Clear is kind, as the saying goes, but so far Orthodoxy, even in its most courageous synodal expressions, has preferred vague formulations and evasions. This hesitancy is certainly connected with the fact that the debate over what can be renewed or developed in Orthodox theology and on what criteria is intense and polarizing. The acute intra-Orthodox controversies of recent years have not facilitated the productive continuation of this discussion. I believe that any attempt to renew or restart the ecumenical effort in Orthodoxy must begin with a substantial critique of its personalism and the consequences this has for ecclesiology. Orthodox theology, and of course there are exceptions, usually approaches the concepts of relationship and communion in an ahistorical and idealized way, with limited awareness of historical complexity. Perichoresis, complementarity of charisms, harmony, or symphonia are terms that dominate the Orthodox vocabulary, creating the impression that everything in the Church ultimately amounts to a harmonious whole. All this sounds fine as long as we agree with one another. However, and exactly because unity is important, the quality and sustainability of ecumenically oriented thinking is judged not by how it handles affirmation and agreement, but primarily by how it handles negation and difference. How much room can theology offer to the other and to the other's no, to the other's negation, without excluding them? What structures can enable the Church to bridge crises and manage differences productively? Can Orthodoxy transcend the dualism of black and white or orthodoxy and heresy? I'm not suggesting that all opinions can coexist in the Church. Relativism undermines ecumenism, which is the effort to restore and deepen the unity of the Church not only in love, but also in truth. However, I believe that a theology of relationship and an ecclesiology that allows for greater differentiation and reflects on ways of managing differences can contribute to a more realistic understanding of the significance and methods of ecumenical dialogue, and also to a clearer perception of who Orthodoxy's interlocutors actually are. Such an approach could free Orthodoxy from the short circuits of simplistic rejections of the others. A theology that sees in the heterodox other not only doctrinal uncertainty and error, but also the gifts of their tradition, can help in this direction. Orthodoxy, and this is associated with its very name, the right faith, the right doxology of God, conveys many times a sense of self-sufficiency. It's something against what Father Scrima struggled, of course. At best, it seeks to offer its gifts to the other, yet it seems to lack curiosity. It does not appear interested in the gifts of the other. Many do not even consider that the other might offer gifts because they reduce him to the heresy he represents, which makes him dangerous. The Roman Catholic Church thought similarly until the paradigm shift brought about by the Second Vatican Council, which introduced a new approach to other churches. The establishment of the Pro Oriente Foundation was not unrelated to this synodal development and showed that Catholicism had begun to take interest in the gifts of the others and to treat these others in a less paternalistic manner. 60 years after Pro Oriente, there is still no Pro Occidente in the East. Do we Orthodox want, not want to be generous? The Greek term for generosity is a compound word evoking both courage and gift, geneos and doro. Generosity requires courage to open oneself to the other, but courage is also needed along with trust, not only to give, but to receive, to accept the gifts of the other, to realize that one is not self-sufficient, that the others can enrich and benefit us with the stimuli of their history, their theology, their achievements, their mistakes, and even with their criticisms. I honestly admit that the critical questions of heterodox Christians and my attempts to respond convincingly have helped me understand Orthodoxy more deeply and love it more than during the earlier period of my life when I was not engaged in dialogue. Ecumenism does not take place in order to confirm our superiority, but to achieve the unity of the Church, a unity promoted not only by affirmation, but also by the other's critical questioning. Orthodoxy must speak and act more generously toward its interlocutors. In any case, intensive work is required to articulate clear positions on the ecclesiological status of the others and their sacraments. It's not enough to highlight the variety of approaches in the history of Orthodoxy. How can we avoid drawing theological conclusions from texts we have signed with other churches, for example in the dialogue with the Oriental Orthodox? What does it mean for our theology of the sacraments and for the ecclesiological reality of other Christian communities when we allow our faithful to participate in their sacraments under certain conditions? And I take into consideration the agreements of some Orthodox patriarchates with Oriental churches. What does the recognition of the baptism of heterodox Christians imply for our ecclesiology? If apophaticism and eschatology lead to epistemological humility, we do not know everything, and to the recognition of the in-via status of the churches on their way toward the eschaton, steps toward openness are possible. Even if orthodoxy eventually takes positions that displease some, it is better to speak honestly than to evade the issue. Ecumenical dialogue needs orthodoxy's well-founded and critical voice. I don't say that we have to say yes to every other theological perspective. But how will orthodoxy take positions on these issues approved by the whole Orthodox family in the current situation of inter-Orthodox conflicts? This is a very, very difficult question. I will not answer it now. I will come to my last point, the importance of structures. The rebooting, or at least the renewal of the ecumenical spirit, cannot take place without solid ecumenical structures within the Orthodox churches. Terms such as system and structure often cause discomfort to Orthodox ears that associate them excessively with the West, rationalism, and the various evils against which anti-Western voices rail. Criticism of ecumenical bureaucracy is entirely justified. In recent years, the ecumenical movement has emphasized spiritual ecumenism, or what since Karlsruhe 2022 has been called the ecumenism of the heart. However, the heart presupposes a body, and the body requires a skeleton to stand and function. As Orthodox Christians, we cannot deny the lack of ecumenical structures in our churches, or serious deficits considering these structures. To clarify what I mean by structures, let me refer to my experience in Germany. The two largest churches in terms of population, the Roman Catholic and the Protestant Church, I mean the EKD context, have ecumenical institutes that study developments in ecumenical dialogue, both national and international, as well as the life of other churches. They organize conferences, plan publications, and offer courses and seminars in ecumenical theology. Almost all dioceses of these churches have committees with experts in ecumenical dialogue to support ecclesial work, plan ecumenical activities and initiatives, and implement the fruits of dialogue, for example, at the parish level. At the national, regional, and local levels, active councils of churches help coordinate actions and organize ecumenical events. Such structures exist not only in Germany, but also in many other countries. It is not surprising, however, that they do not exist with the same frequency or intensity in countries with an Orthodox majority. And in Greece, which I know somewhat better, their absence is striking. It is painful to see how unprepared and uninformed members of Orthodox delegations often are at ecumenical meetings. The presence of Orthodoxy at the plenary sessions of the last assembly of the World Council of Churches in Karlsruhe was highly problematic, as Christians from all over the world had to witness two Orthodox representatives repeatedly asking to speak and offering remarks that were insignificant or far removed from the depth of Eastern theology. And nobody stopped them. Even when capable people are present, and Orthodoxy has many capable ecumenists, including women and including young people, they often lack the necessary support to carry out their work as they should. If Orthodoxy wants to contribute meaningfully to ecumenical dialogue, it must think strategically and it must invest resources. It has to pay. Ecumenism is not free. We need institutes that study ecumenical developments so that Orthodox Christians can be informed about the theology of other churches and correctly evaluate the initiatives of heterodox Christians and events in the life of the other churches. It is unacceptable for the only source of information to be the pamphlets of anti-ecumenists. These structures must train leaders who can later assume executive roles in the ecumenical movement. Such structures should also produce ecumenical thinking, not only for academic research, but also for practical use by the churches. The experts and the institutes I mentioned in Germany support their churches in their ecumenical work. Even if they do not represent their churches in specific dialogues, they ensure that the representatives are well prepared, and we need institutes that develop programs for the reception of ecumenical dialogue among young people or within parishes, informing them about the achievements of ecumenical dialogue and taking initiatives to bring together Christians of different confessions at various levels. Dear friends, ecumenism is not a heresy, but neither is it a luxury for Orthodoxy. It is an expression of obedience to the Lord's command for unity and nothing less. We live in difficult times for unity, both intra-Orthodox and pan-Christian. The Christian world is torn apart by new schisms, while the churches draw closer on some issues and dangerously drift apart on others. Orthodoxy can contribute positively, provided that it clarifies the theoretical basis of its participation and introduces structures that ensure a constructive response to this important task. It's difficult to say which should come first, theological generosity or practical structures. Generous theological thinking can support the introduction of structures, but the proper functioning of structures can also foster more generous thinking. Does all this sound too Western for Eastern Orthodoxy? I do not know, although Orthodox history has not lacked either generosity or structures. Ultimately, both can help our church transcend the East-West thinking and open itself more effectively to the global nature of today's theological and missionary challenges. These challenges call us to think boldly, generously, and structurally. Many thanks.